Wealth is not merely about money, it is about control. And in the story of modern wealth, that control did not emerge overnight. It was meticulously constructed over centuries, shaped by trade, war, politics, and the quiet genius of a few families who understood the world not just as it was, but as it could be. The story begins in Europe, in the bustling streets of Renaissance Florence, where the Medicis pioneered the idea that money could be more than a tool. It could be power. Banks were no longer simple institutions to hold coins. They became engines for influence, lending to kings, funding wars, underwriting commerce. These early financiers discovered that wealth could shape reality itself. As Europe moved from the medieval world into the age of discovery, opportunities for capital multiplied. Spices from India, silver from the New World, and silk from China traveled across oceans, carried not by kings alone, but by those who had learned to command the flow of money. Families like the Medicis, the Fuggers, and later the Rothschilds recognized a truth that few others saw. Whoever controlled finance controlled empires. By the 18th century, Europe was a chessboard of power, but money had become the queen. Wars, treaties, even the rise and fall of monarchies depended on the unseen hands of bankers, not just the armies that marched in the streets. A new era was dawning, one where wealth was no longer tied to land or soldiers alone, but to intelligence, strategy, and the ability to manipulate the world's most liquid asset, trust. And into this world stepped the families who would quietly, inexorably, shape the modern financial landscape. They were not warriors. They were not politicians. They were bankers, industrialists, and resource magnates. Yet their influence was felt in every palace, on every battlefield, in every city where wealth mattered. By the dawn of the 19th century, these families were no longer part of history. They were writing it. In the quiet streets of Frankfurt in the late 18th century, a man named Mayer Amschel Rothschild built something far greater than a bank. He built a dynasty. It began modestly. Coins exchanged, debts recorded, fortunes lent. But what Mayer understood better than anyone else was that money was not merely a commodity. Money was influence, money was power, and if wielded correctly, it could shape the course of nations. Mayer had 5 sons, and he sent them across Europe like chess pieces. Amschel remained in Frankfurt, Salomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Karl in Naples, and James in Paris. By placing each son in the key financial capitals of Europe, Mayer created a network unlike anything the world had ever seen. Letters, transactions, intelligence, they all moved through this invisible web. And it was through this network that the Rothschilds would begin to dominate international finance. Their first great triumph came during the Napoleonic Wars. While nations waged war across Europe, Nathan Rothschild in London orchestrated the movement of bullion, funded armies, and quietly amassed enormous wealth. Some of the stories border on legend, tales of Nathan knowing the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo before the British government and using that knowledge to turn a massive profit. Whether entirely true or embellished over time, the message was clear. The Rothschilds had mastered a system of wealth that transcended borders, but it wasn't just war profiteering that made them powerful. They financed railroads, government bonds, and infrastructure projects across the continent. Kings, ministers, and merchants alike depended on the Rothschilds' capital. Their wealth became a tool of diplomacy and a weapon of leverage. A loan from a Rothschild could decide the fate of an entire kingdom. The Rothschilds' influence also extended to central banking. In an era when governments printed money with little oversight, the Rothschilds became lenders of last resort, stabilizing economies, but in doing so, also embedding themselves deep into the very foundations of European finance. Governments became reliant on them, not just for money, but for advice, strategy, and the invisible hand that guided markets. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild name was synonymous with power, not through armies, not through titles, but through the quiet, relentless accumulation of capital. They were the masters of the money supply, and they understood an essential truth. Wealth alone is fleeting, but control of capital, influence over credit, and the ability to move it across borders is eternal. And yet, the Rothschilds were careful. They wielded power invisibly, anonymously, and strategically. They were not headlines. They were whispers in the corridors of power. While kings and ministers argued and fought, the Rothschilds quietly ensured that the levers of Europe's wealth rested in their hands. By the end of the 19th century, their empire stretched across continents, from gold mines in South Africa to banks in New York, from railroads in France to government treasuries in England. The Rothschilds had achieved what few dynasties ever could, the ability to influence the fate of nations without ever wielding a sword. And as the world stepped into the 20th century, they were no longer just bankers. They were arbiters of global power. At the turn of the 19th century, while Europe's financial dynasties were consolidating their power through banking, a new form of wealth was emerging in the United States, a wealth rooted not in gold or government bonds, but in black liquid, oil. And no one recognized its potential more than John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller's rise was not accidental. He understood that energy would drive the modern world. He founded Standard Oil in 1870, and over the next decades, he transformed it into an empire that controlled nearly every aspect of the American oil industry. From extraction to transportation, refining to distribution, Rockefeller created a vertically integrated monopoly that allowed him to dictate prices, crush competitors, and accumulate a fortune that was, at its peak, equivalent to 2% of the entire U.S. economy. But Rockefeller's genius extended beyond mere business acumen. He understood the power of scale, efficiency, and control. Railroads, which had once been competitors, became tools in his strategy. Rebates and preferential rates ensured that Standard Oil's competitors could not survive. While others were fighting for scraps, Rockefeller was building a machine that not only produced wealth, but ensured dominance. With enormous wealth came enormous influence. Rockefeller understood that money could shape governments, legislation, and public perception. Charities, foundations, and educational endowments became instruments of soft power. The Rockefeller Foundation, established in 1913, funded medical research, education reforms, and even global health initiatives, positioning the family not just as industrialists, but as shapers of society itself. The family's influence reached far beyond the United States. By controlling oil, the lifeblood of industry, transportation, and eventually warfare, the Rockefellers were indirectly dictating the pace of modern civilization. Nations depended on oil, armies needed oil, and cities ran on oil. Whoever controlled it had leverage not just over economies, but over the course of history itself. The Rockefeller model of wealth was different from the Rothschilds. Where the Rothschilds operated quietly in banking corridors across Europe, Rockefeller wielded tangible resources in the open, shaping infrastructure, policy, and innovation. Yet the result was similar. Enormous power concentrated in a single family, influencing decisions that reverberated through governments, industries, and societies worldwide. By the early 20th century, the Rockefellers had achieved something extraordinary. The American century would run on oil, and oil ran through the veins of the Rockefeller empire. Their story is a testament to a fundamental truth. Wealth is not just about accumulation, it is about positioning, foresight, and the ability to control the resources that the world cannot live without. And as the United States emerged as a global power, the Rockefeller dynasty was already quietly shaping the world's trajectory, proving that true influence often comes not from titles or armies, but from controlling the energy that fuels the planet. By the early 20th century, the world had entered a new era, one in which old empires were fading, new powers were rising, and the levers of influence were shifting from the battlefield to the boardroom. At the center of this transformation were two dynasties whose reach extended across continents, the Rothschilds of Europe and the Rockefellers of America. Though they operated in different spheres, banking and industry, finance and resources, their paths increasingly intersected, forming a complex web of power that shaped the modern world. The Rothschilds, masters of credit and international banking, had long controlled the flow of capital across Europe. Governments relied on them to fund wars, stabilize economies, and manage national debts. Their influence was invisible, yet absolute. The Rockefellers, meanwhile, had built an empire on oil, controlling the lifeblood of the industrializing world. As industries and armies expanded, access to energy became as critical as access to money itself. It was inevitable that these two families would become entangled, for capital and resources are inseparable in a world that runs on both. Europe needed energy to rebuild after the devastation of World War I. America needed access to European markets and political influence. Deals were struck quietly behind closed doors. Loans were extended, oil agreements signed, and governments subtly nudged to align with the interests of these families. The relationship was not purely cooperative. Competition existed, but it was strategic. The Rothschilds' banks financed infrastructure projects in which Rockefeller oil would be transported. Rockefeller fortunes invested in enterprises where Rothschild banking networks offered the capital and credibility to succeed. Together, whether intentionally or not, they were shaping the global economy, deciding which industries thrived, which nations prospered, and even which conflicts were funded or mitigated. Wars, too, became a chessboard where influence was exercised with precision. Both families understood that conflict could create opportunities. Governments desperate for funds turned to Rothschild banks. Armies dependent on oil relied on Rockefeller supplies. They had no need to fight directly. The world's governments and corporations did the heavy lifting while their wealth silently pulled the strings. Beyond finance and resources, these families cultivated influence through philanthropy, think tanks, and advisory networks. Universities, research institutions, and policy organizations became subtle channels for ideas that aligned with their vision of global order. By controlling both the means of wealth, capital, and energy, they effectively held sway over the decisions that shaped nations, even when governments appeared independent. Yet they remained largely invisible to the public eye. While newspapers reported on political leaders and industrialists, the Rothschilds and Rockefellers worked in silence, letting power operate like an unseen tide beneath society's surface.